On a crowded morning flight from Los Angeles to New York, a soft sunlight poured through the airport windows. Passengers lined up, juggling coffee cups and carry-ons, while announcements echoed across the terminal. Among them stood Sandra Bullock, her hair tied in a loose bun, wearing a simple gray hoodie and sunglasses. She looked tired but calm, clutching a small journal. Her last film premiere had drained her, and this flight was supposed to be a quiet escape. Keanu Reeves arrived quietly a few minutes later. His steps were unhurried, his black jacket a little wrinkled, and there was no entourage following him. To most people around, he looked like any regular traveler. But the check-in staff recognized him immediately, whispering softly but respectfully. Keanu simply smiled, thanked them for their work, and slipped away toward security, leaving no trace of ego behind. The subtle kindness in his manner caught the attention of a young boy waiting in line, who whispered to his mother that the man seemed peaceful. Once inside the plane, Sandra slid into her aisle seat and glanced at the window beside her. The view outside was bright and inviting, clouds stretching across a blue sky. She sighed. The window seat was taken by a quiet man in a black jacket, Keanu. They exchanged polite smiles, not recognizing each other at first. Sandra hesitated, then softly said, "I really love watching the sky when we fly." Her voice was low, almost apologetic. Keanu looked at her for a moment, his eyes warm and thoughtful. Without saying a single word, he unbuckled, stepped into the aisle, and gestured for her to take his seat. His quiet action spoke louder than any reply. As Sandra slid into the window seat, something inside her shifted. She had not expected such a simple, selfless gesture. Outside, the plane began to taxi and sunlight spilled across her face. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small sense of peace. Keanu sat beside her, still silent, giving her the space to settle. Around them, passengers adjusted seatbelts, stowed bags, and prepared for the long flight. But for Sandra, the world felt a little softer. The flight took off, engines roaring, and the ground below shrank into patterns of roads and rivers. As clouds swallowed the view, a sudden jolt shook the cabin. A child 2 rows back started to cry, frightened by the turbulence. Keanu turned, his expression calm and reassuring. He gave a small smile to the child, then reached for his backpack and pulled out a small paper crane he had folded earlier. He leaned across the aisle, offering it gently. The child's tears paused, curiosity taking over fear. Sandra watched, quietly amazed by the depth of care in such a simple act. Half an hour into the flight, the captain's voice announced unexpected heavy weather ahead. The cabin dimmed slightly as clouds thickened, and raindrops streaked the windows. Sandra's fingers gripped the armrest unconsciously. She hated turbulence. Keanu noticed, his voice finally breaking the silence, soft and steady. "It's going to be fine. Just a few bumps." His tone wasn't forced reassurance. It felt genuine, almost protective. Sandra met his gaze and, for a fleeting moment, felt anchored. As the turbulence worsened, an overhead bin popped open nearby, spilling a bag into the aisle. A man scrambled to catch it, but the bag's zipper broke, scattering papers everywhere. Passengers gasped. Without hesitation, Keanu unbuckled, steadied himself against the rocking cabin, and began gathering the papers. Sandra joined him. Together they collected the scattered pages, handing them back to the grateful man. Keanu's quiet strength and calm movements steadied more than just the papers. People around him seemed to relax, seeing someone handle chaos with grace. Minutes passed, and the plane finally leveled. The tension in the cabin eased, replaced by soft chatter and nervous laughter. Sandra looked out the window again, watching sunlight break through a gap in the clouds. Keanu leaned back, his eyes half closed, but there was a faint smile on his face. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. His kindness had no audience, no performance. And that, more than anything, left an impression on her. As the flight continued, Sandra found herself wondering about the stranger beside her. She knew who he was now, everyone did eventually. But in this moment, he wasn't a famous actor or a Hollywood legend. He was simply a man who gave up a seat without a word, calmed a child with a paper crane, and steadied a cabin with quiet courage. For Sandra, and for the viewers who will watch this story unfold, that was the beginning of something powerful, an unspoken reminder that small, Humble actions can change how the world feels, even 30,000 feet in the air. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane steadied against a stretch of clear sky. Sandra leaned her forehead against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Below, the clouds looked like rolling mountains of white, endless and quiet. She whispered almost to herself, "It feels like another world up here." Keanu turned his head, hearing the softness in her voice, and for a moment his eyes caught the reflection of her wonder. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth curved into a subtle smile. That silence carried more meaning than words ever could. A flight attendant walked past, balancing a tray of drinks. A sudden tremor of turbulence made one of the cups wobble dangerously. Keanu reached out calmly, steadying the cup before it could fall. The attendant's eyes widened in relief, and she whispered, "Thank you." Keanu just nodded, brushing it off like it was nothing. Sandra watched him, a small warmth blooming in her chest. She wasn't used to moments like this. Moments where kindness wasn't followed by cameras or applause. Time seemed to stretch as the passengers settled into quiet conversations or soft naps. Sandra opened her small journal, flipping through pages filled with half-written thoughts. She hesitated, then wrote a single line. "Sometimes the quietest people make the loudest impact." She didn't realize Keanu had glanced at the journal. He didn't comment. He simply looked away, respecting her privacy. But the line stayed with him. An hour later, a low alarm chimed, and the captain's voice came over the speakers. His tone was calm but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to experience a pocket of severe turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your belts," the cabin murmured with unease. Sandra's hand tightened on the armrest again. Keanu noticed and, without hesitation, placed his hand lightly over hers. The gesture was gentle, offering reassurance without making a scene. His fingers were warm, steady. Sandra glanced at him, startled but comforted. She didn't pull her hand away. The plane lurched violently, drawing gasps and a few cries from the passengers. An elderly woman across the aisle dropped her reading glasses, which slid out of reach under the seat. Keanu unbuckled just enough to retrieve them, his movements controlled despite the shaking. He handed them back with a kind smile. "You're safe," he said quietly. The woman's trembling lips curved into a small, grateful smile. Nearby, a teenage boy whispered to his sister, "He's not even scared." But the truth was, Keanu wasn't fearless, he was deliberate, focused on calming others before himself. The turbulence passed as quickly as it came, leaving the cabin in a stunned, quiet relief. Some passengers laughed nervously, some wiped their eyes. Sandra exhaled, realizing how tightly she had been holding her breath. Keanu's hand was still over hers. She looked at him, and for a brief moment the chaos outside the plane felt distant. "You're steady," she said, her voice a mix of wonder and gratitude. Keanu gave a small laugh, low, unpretentious. "Just been on a lot of flights," he replied, but his tone carried a quiet humility that hinted at a deeper strength. Hours later, the cabin was dark except for a few overhead reading lights. Many passengers were asleep. Sandra couldn't rest. She glanced at Keanu, who was leaning back with his eyes closed, his headphones barely audible. She noticed a small notebook sticking out of his jacket pocket. Curiosity flickered, but she didn't pry. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the window, where the moonlit clouds drifted below like silver waves. Suddenly, a muffled commotion broke the calm, a child's panicked coughing from the back of the plane. A woman's anxious voice called for help. Sandra turned quickly, her heart racing. Before anyone else reacted, Keanu was already unbuckled, moving quietly but quickly down the aisle. He knelt beside the child and spoke softly to the worried mother, his voice calm and steady. "It's okay, take a deep breath. Let's see what we can do." He reached for the overhead call button to summon the crew and offered the mother his own water bottle. The flight attendant arrived with an inhaler from the medical kit, but the moment of panic had already begun to ease, anchored by Keanu's quiet presence. When he returned to his seat, Sandra's eyes followed him. "You didn't even think twice," she said softly. Keanu shrugged, a modest gesture. "Nobody should feel alone up here," he replied. His words lingered in the air like a gentle promise. As the flight stretched on, The world outside turned from night to the first hints of dawn. A pale orange glow crept across the horizon, painting the clouds in soft colors. Sandra felt something stir within her, a reminder of why simple acts matter. She thought about how many times she'd been surrounded by people but felt unseen, and how this stranger's unspoken kindness had quietly shifted her view. She realized that sometimes it isn't grand gestures or headlines that heal. It's the quiet surrender of a window seat, the rescue of a paper crane, the steadying of a trembling hand. The dawn light grew brighter, spilling through the window, and Sandra turned to Keanu. "I think you just saved more hearts on this flight than you know," she whispered. Keanu opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. He didn't answer with words. He simply smiled, a quiet smile that reached his eyes as the sun rose above the clouds. A soft glow bathed the cabin as the sun climbed higher, turning clouds into fields of gold. The passengers stirred awake, stretching and yawning, unaware that quiet stories of kindness had already unfolded among them. Sandra kept her gaze on the horizon, mesmerized by the shifting light. Her fingers traced a small circle on the fogged window, almost unconsciously. She turned to Keanu, studying the lines of calm on his face. There was a mystery about him, the kind that isn't built on fame, but on a deeper, quieter strength. A flight attendant began handing out breakfast trays. One tray wobbled as a passenger accidentally nudged her elbow. Keanu caught the tray before it could fall, his reflexes fast and gentle. The attendant whispered a quick thank you, her cheeks pink with relief. The moment was small, easily missed, but Sandra noticed. She wondered how many small moments like these Keanu collected, quietly without ever announcing them. Later, as coffee cups clinked and passengers settled back, a sudden voice broke through the hum. A young man across the aisle was frantically searching under his seat. "My grandmother's ring," he muttered, panic rising in his tone. "It slipped off my finger." His voice carried the weight of loss. Keanu was on his feet in an instant, crouching to help. Sandra joined him, and soon a few other passengers were on their hands and knees, scanning the carpet. The search stretched on until finally Keanu reached under a seat 2 rows ahead and retrieved the small gold ring. He held it up with a gentle grin, handing it back to the trembling young man. Applause rippled softly through the cabin, but Keanu only brushed it off, saying, "Teamwork." Sandra felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just the ring. It was the way strangers had united, even for a moment. As the plane cruised smoothly, Sandra leaned closer to the window, her voice low but clear. "You always like this?" she asked. Keanu tilted his head, pretending not to understand. "Like what?" She hesitated, then said, "Quiet, but always watching, always ready." Keanu thought for a moment, then answered quietly, "I just think the world gives us small chances to be decent. If we don't take them, we miss something bigger." His words hung in the air, soft but powerful. A few rows back, the same child who had cried earlier was now giggling, playing with the paper crane Keanu had given him. The mother glanced forward, catching Keanu's eye, and mouthed, "Thank you." He nodded slightly, not drawing attention. Sandra couldn't help but smile. She'd worked in an industry where kindness often came with cameras. This was different. It was pure. 2 hours into the flight, the captain's voice returned, announcing unexpected headwinds that would delay their arrival. Groans and sighs filled the cabin. A businessman grumbled loudly about missing his meeting. Sandra watched Keanu's expression. There was no irritation, only patience. He leaned toward the businessman, offering a quiet suggestion about rescheduling and even sharing a personal story about a time delays had saved him from an unforeseen disaster. The man paused, his anger softening. Sandra was struck by how easily kindness disarmed frustration. The hours dragged and the cabin lights dimmed again for passengers to rest. Sandra felt restless. She opened her journal once more, glancing at the lines she had written earlier. Her pen hovered over the page before she added another. "A stranger's calm can feel like a lighthouse in a storm." She didn't notice Keanu glance briefly at the page before turning back to his window. Outside, the world below was a canvas of shifting blues and whites. Then came an unexpected announcement from the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, We're making an unscheduled stop for a medical emergency on board. Gasps and whispers rippled through the cabin. A middle-aged man a few rows back had collapsed, his face pale. Panic stirred. A flight attendant rushed to assist, calling for any medical professionals. No one stepped forward. The tension was palpable. Keanu stood, steadying himself against the seatbacks. He crouched beside the man, checking his breathing, his voice calm. "He's still breathing! Let's get him flat!" Sandra quickly followed, helping the attendant clear space. Another passenger retrieved the emergency medical kit. The plane dipped slightly as the pilot adjusted course. The cabin was a mix of fear and hope. Keanu guided the man's head gently, speaking to him even though he was unconscious. "You're not alone. Stay with us." His voice was like an anchor. Sandra handed him a bottle of water and a cool cloth from a nearby passenger. Together, they stabilized the man until the plane could land for emergency care. The teamwork between strangers felt profound, people of different ages, backgrounds, and stories moving as one to help. As the plane descended, Sandra looked at Keanu. Her heart pounded, not just from adrenaline, but from something deeper. She saw the way he held himself, not as a star, not as a hero, but as a man who believed in showing up for others. Outside, the ground rushed closer, the world below waiting to meet them. When the plane touched down at a nearby airport for the emergency, paramedics boarded quickly. The man was taken off safely, still unconscious but stable. As the cabin exhaled in relief, the passengers exchanged glances that said everything: gratitude, awe, and a quiet understanding that they'd just shared something rare. As they waited for clearance to continue the journey, Sandra turned to Keanu, her voice soft. "You changed how this plane feels?" Keanu shook his head slightly. "We all did," he replied. But Sandra knew better. Sometimes it only takes one person's steady heart to remind everyone else of their own. The engines hummed softly as the plane taxied back onto the runway after the emergency stop. The cabin had shifted. Something unspoken now connected everyone on board. Whispers of relief faded into thoughtful silence. Sandra glanced out the window at the small airport disappearing behind them. She could still feel the rush of adrenaline from helping the collapsed passenger. Her hands trembled slightly, but when she looked at Keanu beside her, she found steadiness again. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held a quiet alertness, like someone who never stopped caring. As the plane ascended once more, a golden light spilled across the sky. Sandra's reflection appeared faintly in the glass, and behind it, Keanu's calm profile. She studied him for a long moment, her curiosity deepening. She finally asked, "Does it ever feel heavy?" Keanu turned slightly, puzzled. "Being the one who's always there for others," she clarified. Keanu thought for a moment, then said softly, "It only feels heavy when you expect thanks. But when you don't, it's just living." His words were quiet, but struck something deep inside her. A little girl across the aisle timidly waved at Sandra, clutching the paper crane Keanu had folded. Sandra smiled warmly and waved back. The girl's father whispered a thank you to Keanu. He responded with a simple nod, again deflecting attention. Sandra noticed how each interaction with him felt like water smoothing a rough stone. Gentle, unassuming, but powerful. Hours passed, and the captain announced clear skies ahead. Some passengers began chatting, laughter returning in small bursts. Sandra and Keanu shared light conversation. About travel, about the films she'd worked on, about quiet places he liked to visit when life got loud. His stories weren't grand or glamorous. They were about small cafes, street musicians, and strangers who once showed him kindness. Each story was like a thread weaving humility into the moment. Then, an unexpected sound broke the calm, a sudden sharp bang from the luggage compartment above row 12. The plane jolted slightly, and murmurs filled the cabin. A latch had loosened, and a small suitcase tumbled down, narrowly missing an elderly passenger. Keanu was on his feet instantly, steadying the compartment door and lifting the bag safely back into place. He reassured the startled passengers with a small smile. "Just a loose latch," he said, his voice steady and warm. His calmness smoothed the tension like a hand on water. Sandra watched him, a thought forming silently. The world might look at him and see fame, But she was beginning to see the quiet hero beneath the headlines. She realized how rare it was to witness someone whose kindness was not a performance. Later, as the plane sailed above endless clouds, a group of college students nearby began discussing their fears about the future. Jobs, expectations, feeling lost. Their voices carried just enough for Sandra and Keanu to hear. One of the students sighed. Sometimes it feels like no one cares. Keanu leaned slightly toward them, not intruding but offering a gentle truth. Someone always cares. You might not see them yet, but they're there. Sometimes it's a stranger on a plane. His words were simple, but the students looked at each other, visibly moved. Sandra felt a shiver run through her, not of fear, but of awe at how effortlessly he could touch hearts. As twilight approached, the sky outside transformed into a masterpiece, violet hues melting into deep orange. Sandra pressed her forehead against the window again, the colors painting her face. "This might be the most beautiful sunset I've ever seen," she whispered. Keanu smiled faintly. "Beauty's louder when you've been through a storm first," he replied. His words carried the memory of the turbulence, the collapsed passenger, and all the quiet acts in between. When the cabin lights dimmed for the evening leg of the flight, a flight attendant brought Sandra and Keanu 2 cups of tea as a gesture of thanks. Sandra cradled hers, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. She glanced at Keanu, her voice low. "You didn't have to give up your seat, or catch that tray, or help that man." Keanu took a slow sip, then answered simply, "Maybe I didn't. But maybe someone once did those things for me." As the plane continued its journey, the passengers began to drift off again, their breathing soft and even. Sandra couldn't sleep. She replayed the day's events in her mind, the way small choices had rippled through a cabin full of strangers. She thought about her own life, the moments she had been too busy or too tired to notice someone else's need. And now, sitting next to a man who had quietly changed the atmosphere of an entire flight, she felt the weight of that realization. Keanu seemed to sense her thoughts. Without opening his eyes, he said quietly, "Sometimes kindness is invisible until you're close enough to feel it." The words wrapped around her like a blanket. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Outside, stars began to pierce the darkening sky, tiny points of light guiding them forward. The hum of the engines became a lullaby for the cabin. A soft snore came from somewhere behind them, and Sandra smiled to herself. She glanced once more at Keanu, who now looked completely at peace, and whispered under her breath, "You've changed this flight for everyone." Then she turned back to the window, where the horizon seemed endless and full of promise. A quiet stillness filled the cabin as midnight wrapped the sky outside. The plane glided through a velvet darkness scattered with distant stars. Sandra leaned her cheek against the cool window and watched the twinkling lights below fade into nothingness. It was strange, how small the world looked from up here, and yet how enormous the feelings inside her had grown over the past few hours. She could feel the shift. Something invisible yet powerful had settled among the passengers, a shared awareness of kindness's quiet power. A sudden sound broke the peace, a soft whimper from the elderly woman who had earlier dropped her glasses. Her hands trembled as she searched her purse, muttering about her heart medication. Panic flashed in her eyes. Without hesitation, Keanu was out of his seat again. He knelt beside her, his voice calm and even. "Take a slow breath, ma'am. Let's find what you need." Sandra joined him, helping search under seats and in the overhead bin. A young man nearby offered his flashlight. Within seconds, the small white bottle was found wedged between 2 cushions. The woman's shoulders sagged in relief, and she whispered, "Thank you. You saved me tonight." Keanu only smiled softly. "We're all looking out for each other here." As the crisis passed, a ripple of gratitude spread quietly through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances and faint smiles, as if silently agreeing that something extraordinary was happening on this ordinary flight. Sandra looked at Keanu and felt an ache in her chest, not sadness but awe. Later, as most passengers slept, a soft conversation began between Sandra and a teenage girl sitting in the row ahead. The girl admitted she was terrified of flying. "Every bump makes me think we're falling," she said, her voice shaking. Sandra wanted to comfort her, but before she could speak, Keanu leaned forward slightly and said gently, "When I was a kid, I was scared too. Then someone told me, 'You can't control the sky, but you can trust the wings.' It helped me. Maybe it can help you." The girl's shoulders loosened and a faint smile appeared. Sandra caught the way Keanu's words landed like a soft anchor. The hours crawled on, and the cabin felt like a small, floating village. Sandra noticed small, almost invisible changes. Strangers now exchanged nods of understanding. A businessman offered his blanket to a shivering passenger, and a college student quietly handed his earbuds to a crying toddler's mother so she could soothe him with music. The energy of the flight had shifted. It wasn't just about reaching a destination anymore. It was about the quiet connections forming mid-air. A brief announcement from the captain warned of another stretch of rough air ahead. A low groan rippled through the cabin. As the turbulence began, trays rattled softly and a few passengers gripped their armrests. Sandra felt her pulse quicken but remembered Keanu's steady hand from before. She glanced at him. This time, he didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he gave her a reassuring nod as if saying, "You've got this now." And she did. The plane shuddered, then smoothed again, and Sandra realized she was calmer than she'd ever been during a flight. As the night deepened, the plane crossed over a lightning storm far below. Flashes of silver and blue illuminated the clouds, casting brief bursts of light across the cabin walls. Sandra watched in silence, her heart beating a little faster. She whispered to Keanu, "It's like watching the sky breathe." He glanced at the storm and replied quietly, "Even storms can be beautiful from the right distance." His words lingered in the air, carrying a sense of perspective that stretched beyond the flight itself. Just before dawn, the flight attendants began preparing for the final stretch. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. Passengers stirred, rubbing their eyes and stretching their stiff legs. The young man who had lost his grandmother's ring earlier approached Keanu and Sandra. "I don't know how to repay you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Keanu shook his head gently. "Don't repay, just pass it on someday." Sandra watched as the young man nodded, visibly moved. The first streaks of morning light broke across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. Sandra felt her throat tighten. She turned to Keanu and said softly, "You've changed this flight, you know?" Keanu looked at her, his expression open and humble. "Maybe the flight was always ready to change," he replied. His words carried a wisdom that made Sandra's chest ache again. As the cabin filled with soft chatter, a small boy from the back of the plane walked forward, holding the paper crane. He approached Keanu shyly and whispered, "Can you show me how to make another?" Keanu smiled and nodded. He retrieved another piece of paper from his backpack and patiently folded another crane step by step. Soon a few children gathered around, following along, their small hands fumbling with the folds. Laughter bubbled up quietly, weaving joy through the early morning air. Sandra watched, her heart swelling, realizing that sometimes the smallest acts build the strongest memories. Outside, the rising sun crowned the clouds with light, a reminder that even after storms, warmth returns. Sandra felt an unfamiliar calm wash over her, as if the universe itself had whispered a promise through the hum of the engines and the kindness of a stranger beside her. The cabin glowed with soft morning light as the final hours of the flight ticked away. The air felt lighter now, as if kindness itself had pressed pause on the usual rush of travel. Sandra kept her gaze on the horizon, watching the colors shift from gold to pale blue. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed that this flight would stay with her forever, not because of her own fame or Keanu's, but because of the quiet way 100 strangers had been reminded of their shared humanity. A flight attendant's voice broke the gentle murmur. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." People adjusted their seats, gathered their belongings, and exchanged sleepy smiles. But among the familiar sounds of landing prep, a new energy pulsed through the cabin, the kind that lingers when strangers have shared something extraordinary. A young woman seated behind Sandra leaned forward. "I was scared to fly today," she admitted softly, "but watching everyone, especially him," she nodded toward Keanu. "Change that. It reminded me that people can still be good. Her words sent a shiver down Sandra's spine. She turned to Keanu, but he only gave a small, almost bashful smile, as if to deflect the praise. The plane dipped slightly, catching a gust of wind. A few passengers gasped, but this time there was no panic, only a collective breath and the quiet knowledge that they'd all weathered worse together. Sandra glanced down the aisle. She saw the college students who'd worried about their futures, now laughing quietly. The businessman who had grumbled earlier now helping an elderly woman stow her blanket, and the children clutching paper cranes like precious treasures. It was as if the flight itself had been transformed into a small, floating community. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his small notebook. He opened to a blank page and scribbled something quickly. Sandra noticed but didn't pry. After a moment, he tore out the page, folded it once, and slipped it onto her journal resting on the tray table. "For later," he said simply. She nodded, choosing not to look yet, savoring the suspense. As the city below came into view, skylines and rivers glinting under the morning sun, the passengers straightened in their seats. Sandra felt her heart tighten. She wasn't ready for this flight to end. She turned to Keanu and whispered, "I don't think I'll ever forget this." Keanu looked out the window at the sprawling cityscape, then back at her. "Maybe flights like this aren't meant to be forgotten," he said, his voice gentle. "Maybe they're meant to remind us who we can be." The plane touched down smoothly, wheels humming against the runway. A ripple of applause broke out, a tradition often mocked, but today it felt genuine, like a collective exhale. As passengers began gathering their belongings, there was a lingering reluctance to leave. People lingered in the aisles, exchanging quiet words of thanks, shy smiles or nods of recognition. The man whose grandmother's ring had been saved approached Keanu once more, clasping his shoulder. "You reminded me of what matters," he said simply. Keanu nodded, his expression humble, offering no speech, no spotlight. When the doors opened and the morning light flooded the cabin, Sandra waited as Keanu helped an elderly woman retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment. She stepped into the aisle behind him, and as they reached the exit, she finally unfolded the note he'd left on her journal. The handwriting was simple and steady. "Sometimes a small seat change can shift an entire sky." Her throat tightened as she read the words. She slipped the paper into her journal, pressing it between the pages like a flower she never wanted to lose. Outside the gate, the terminal bustled with hurried travelers and distant announcements. But the group from their flight lingered, passengers who would soon scatter to different cities, different lives, but who would carry a shared memory stitched together by small, quiet acts. A child waved one last time with a paper crane in hand. The young woman afraid of flying took a deep breath that sounded freer than before. And Sandra, holding her journal close, looked at Keanu with a new kind of respect, one that didn't come from his fame, but from his heart. As they walked toward baggage claim, Sandra whispered almost to herself, "The world needs more of this." Keanu glanced at her, his expression thoughtful, then said, "The world already has it. Sometimes it just takes 30,000 feet to see it." The two of them stepped into the flow of travelers, disappearing into the crowd. Behind them, the morning sun streamed through the airport windows, catching the wings of planes waiting on the tarmac, reminding anyone who cared to look that kindness, like sunlight reaches further than we ever realize.